Hi, my sweet friends, and welcome back to Crochet Every Day with Judy. Today we're reading again from Robinson Crusoe, starting with Chapter 5, Building My Home. My thoughts were now wholly employed with securing myself against either savages, if any should appear, or wild beasts, if any were in the island. I had many thoughts of the method how to do this, and what kind of dwelling to make. I considered whether I should make a cave in the earth or a tent upon the earth, and finally I decided upon both. I soon found that the place I was in was not suitable for my home, partly because it was low, marshy ground near the sea, and I believed it would not be wholesome, and more particularly because there was no fresh water near it. Accordingly, I resolved to find a more healthy and more convenient spot of ground. I considered several things in choosing my location: health and fresh water, I just now mentioned, shelter from the heat of the sun, security from ravenous creatures, whether man or beast, a view of the sea, so that if God sent any ship in sight, I might not lose any advantage for my deliverance, of which I was not willing to banish all hope yet. In search of a place proper for this, I found a little plain on the side of a rising hill. The front toward this little plain was as steep as a house side, so that nothing could come down upon me from the top. On the side of this rock there was a hollow place, worn a little way in, like the entrance or door of a cave, but there was not really any cave or way into the rock at all. On the flat of the green just before this hollow place I resolved to pitch my tent. This plain was not above 100 yards broad and about twice as long, and lay like a green before my door. At the end it descended irregularly into the low grounds by the seaside. It was on the northwest side of the hill, so that I was sheltered from the heat every day, till it came to a west and by south sun, or thereabouts, which in those countries is near the setting. Before I set up my tent, I drew a half circle before the hollow place, which took in about 10 yards in its semi-diameter from the rock, and 20 yards in its diameter from its beginning and ending. In this half circle I pitched 2 rows of strong stakes, driving them into the ground till they stood very firm like piles, the biggest end being out of the ground about 5 feet and a half, and sharpened on the top. Excuse me. The 2 rows did not stand more than 6 inches from one another. Then I took the pieces of cable which I had cut in the ship and laid them in rows one upon the other, within the circle between these 2 rows of stakes, up to the top. I placed other stakes in the inside, leaning against them, about 2.5 feet high, like a spur to a post. This fence was so strong that neither man nor beast could get into it or over it. This cost me a great deal of time and labor, especially to cut the piles in the woods, bring them to the place, and drive them into the earth. The entrance into this place I made to be not by a door, but by a short ladder to go over the top. When I was in, I lifted the ladder over after me, and so I was completely fenced in and fortified, as I thought, from all the world. Consequently, I slept secure in the night, which otherwise I could not have done. As it appeared afterwards, however, there was no need of all this caution from the enemies that I feared. Into this fence or fortress, with infinite labor, I carried all my riches, all my provisions, ammunition, and stores, of which you have the account above. To protect me from the rains, which in one part of the year are very violent there, I made a large double tent, one smaller tent within, and one larger tent above it. Excuse me, sorry. I covered the uppermost with a large tarpaulin which I had saved among the sails. I no longer slept in the bed which I had brought on shore, but in a hammock which was indeed a very good one, and had belonged to the mate of the ship. Into my tent I brought all my provisions and everything that would spoil by the wet. When I had brought my goods, I closed up the entrance, which till now I had left open, and after that passed and repassed, as I said, by a short ladder. When I had done this, I began to work my way into the rock. I brought all the earth and stones that I dug down out through my tent, and laid them up within my fence in the nature of a terrace, so that it raised the ground about 1.5 feet. Thus I made a cave just behind my tent, which served me as a cellar to my house. It cost me much labor and many days before all these things were brought to perfection, and therefore I must go back to some other things which took up some of my thoughts. At the same time it happened, after I had laid my scheme for the setting up my tent and making the cave, that a storm of rain fell from a thick dark cloud. There was a sudden flash of lightning, and after that a great clap of thunder. I was not so much surprised by the lightning as I was terrified by a thought which darted into my mind as swift as the lightning itself. My powder! My very heart sank within me when I thought that at one blast all my powder might be destroyed, on which not my defense only, but the providing food, as I thought, entirely depended. I was not nearly so anxious about my own danger, though. Had the powder taken fire, I should never have known what had hurt me. Such impression did this make upon me, that after the storm was over, I laid aside all my works, my building and fortifying, and applied myself to making bags and boxes to separate the powder. I put but little in each package, and then hid the box or bag in the rocks as far from the others as I could. I did this in the hope that even if one part of my powder was struck, the rest might be saved. I finished this work in about a fortnight, and I think my powder, which in all was about 240 pounds, was divided in not less than 100 parcels. As to the barrel that had been wet, I did not expect any danger from that, so I placed it in my new cave, which in my fancy I called my kitchen. The rest I hid up and down in holes among the rocks so that no wet might come to it, marking very carefully where I laid it. In the interval of time while I was doing this, I went out once at least every day with my gun, as well to divert myself as to see if I could kill anything fit for food, and as near as I could to acquaint myself with what the island produced. The first time I went out, I presently discovered that there were goats in the island, which was a great satisfaction to me, but then it was attended with this misfortune that they were so shy, so subtle, and so swift of foot that it was the most difficult thing in the world to come at them. But I was not discouraged at this, not doubting that I might now and then shoot one, as it soon happened. After I had found their haunts, I laid wait in this manner for them. I observed that if they saw me in the valleys, though they were upon the rocks, they would run away as in a terrible fright, but if they were feeding in the valleys and I was upon the rocks, they took no notice of me. From this I concluded that by the position of their eyes, their sight was so directed downward that they did not readily see objects that were above them, so afterwards I took this method. I always climbed the rocks first to get above them, and then I had frequently a fair mark. The first shot I made among these creatures, I killed a she-goat which had a little kid by her. This grieved me greatly, but when the old one fell, the kid stood stock still by her till I came and took her up. Not only so, but when I carried the old one with me upon my shoulders, the kid followed me quite to my enclosure. Upon this, I laid down the dam and took the kid in my arms and carried it over my pail in the hope of taming it. But it would not eat, so I was forced to kill it and eat it myself. These two supplied me with flesh a great while, for I ate sparingly and saved my provisions, my bread especially, as much as I possibly could. Now that I had fixed my habitation, I found it absolutely necessary to provide a place to make a fire in and fuel to burn. What I did for that, as also how I enlarged my cave, and what conveniences I made, I shall give a full account of in its place, but I must first give some little account of myself, and of my thoughts about living, which it may well be supposed were not a few. My outlook was dismal, for as I was not cast away upon that island without being driven, as is said, by a violent storm quite out of the course of our intended voyage, and a great way, some hundreds of leagues out of the ordinary course of the trade of mankind, I had great reason to consider it as a determination of heaven that in this desolate place and in this desolate manner I should end my life. The tears would run plentifully down my face when I made these reflections, and sometimes I would wonder why Providence should thus completely ruin his creatures, and render them so absolutely miserable, so without help, so entirely depressed, that it could hardly be rational to be thankful for such a life. But something always returned swift upon me to check these thoughts and reprove me. I remember particularly one day when I was walking with my gun in my hand by the seaside. I was very pensive upon the subject of my present condition, when reason, as it were, expostulated with me the other way, thus, "Well, you are in a desolate condition, it is true, but pray remember, where are the rest of you? Did not 11 of you come into the boat? Where are the 10? Why were they not saved and you lost? Why were you singled out? Is it better to be here or there? All evils are to be considered with the good that is in them, and with what worse attends them." Then it occurred to me again how well I was furnished for my subsistence, and what would have been my case if it had not happened, which was 100,000 to 1, that the ship floated from the place where she first struck, and was driven so near the shore that I had time to get all these things out of her. What would have been my case if I had had to live in the condition in which I at first came on shore, without necessaries of life, or necessaries to supply and procure them? Particularly, said I aloud, though to myself, what should I have done without a gun, without ammunition, without any tools to make anything, or to work with, without clothes, bedding, a tent, or any manner of covering? And now that I had all these to a sufficient quantity, I was in a fair way to provide myself in such a manner as to live without my gun when my ammunition was spent, so that I was reasonably sure of living without any want as long as I lived. I had considered from the beginning how I should provide for the accidents that might happen, and for the time that was to come, even not only after my ammunition should be spent, but even after my health or strength should decay. I confess I had not entertained any notion of my ammunition being destroyed at one blast, and this made the thoughts of it so surprising to me when it lightened and thundered, as I observed just now. And now, being about to enter into the melancholy story of a scene of silent life, such perhaps as was never heard of in the world before, I shall take it from its beginning and continue it in its order. It was, by my account, the 30th of September, when in the manner as above said, I first set foot upon this horrid island. The sun, being to us in its autumnal equinox, was almost directly over my head. I reckoned myself, by observation, to be in the latitude of 9 degrees and 22 minutes north of the line. After I had been there about 10 or 12 days, it came into my thoughts that I should lose my reckoning of time for want of books and pen and ink, and should even confuse the Sabbath days with the working days. To prevent this, I cut with my knife upon a large post in capital letters, "I came on shore here on the 30th of September, 1659. Making it into a great cross, I set it up on the shore where I first landed. Upon the sides of this square post, I cut every day a notch with my knife, and every 7th notch was as long again as the rest, and every first day of the month as long again as that long one. And thus I kept my calendar, or weekly, monthly, and yearly reckoning of time. In the next place, we are to observe that, among the many things which I brought out of the ship in the several voyages which I made to it, I got several things of less value, but not all less useful to me, which I omitted setting down before, in particular, pens, ink, and paper, several parcels in the captain's, mates, gunners, and carpenter's keeping, 3 or 4 compasses, some mathematical instruments, dials, perspective glasses, charts, and books of navigation. All these I huddled together, whether I might want them or not. Also, I found 3 very good Bibles, which came to me in my cargo from England, and which I had packed up among my things. There were some Portuguese books also, and among them 2 or 3 Popish prayer books, and several other books, all of which I carefully secured. And I must not forget that we had in the ship a dog and 2 cats, of whose history I may have occasion to say something in its place. I carried both the cats with me, and the dog jumped out of the ship himself and swam on shore to me the day after I went on shore with my first cargo. He was a trusty servant to me for many years. I wanted nothing that he could bring me, or any company that he could make up to me. I only wanted to have him talk to me, but that he could not do. As I observed before, I found pen, ink, and paper, and I husbanded them to the utmost. I shall show that, while my ink lasted, I kept things very exact. But after that was gone, I could not, for I could not make any ink by any means that I could devise. This put me in mind that I wanted many things, notwithstanding all that I had gathered together. Of these, ink was one, as were a spade, a pickaxe, and a shovel, to dig or remove the earth, needles, pins, and thread. As for linen, I soon learned to do without that without much difficulty. This want of tools made every work I did go on heavily, and it was nearly a whole year before I had entirely finished my little pail and my dwelling. The piles or stakes, which were as heavy as I could well lift, took a long time to cut and prepare in the woods, and more by far to bring home, so that I spent sometimes 2 days in cutting and bringing home one of these posts, and a 3rd day in driving it into the ground. For this purpose I got a heavy piece of wood at first, but at last I thought of using one of the iron crowbars. Even with this, driving those posts or piles was very tiresome and tedious work. But I had no need to be concerned at the tediousness of anything I had to do, seeing I had time enough to do it in, nor had I any other employment if that had been over, at least that I could foresee, except arranging the island to seek for food, which I did more or less every day. I have already described my habitation, which was a tent under the side of a rock, surrounded with a strong pale of posts and cables. But I might now rather call it a wall, for I raised a kind of wall up against it of turf about 2 feet thick on the outside. After some time, I think it was a year and a half, I raised rafters from it, leaning to the rock, and thatched or covered it with boughs of trees and such things as I could get to keep out the rain, which I found at some times of the year very violent. I have already observed how I brought all my goods into this pail and into the cave which I had made behind me. At first this was a confused heap of goods, which, as they lay in no order, took up all my place so that I had no room to turn myself. Accordingly, I set to work to enlarge my cave and work farther into the earth, for it was a loose, sandy rock which yielded easily to the labor I bestowed on it. When I found I was pretty safe as to beasts of prey, I worked sideways to the right hand into the rock, and then turning to the right again, worked quite out and made a door to come out on the outside of my pale or fortification. This gave me not only a way of going in and out, as it were a back way to my tent and to my stone house, but it gave me also room to stow my goods. And now I began to apply myself to make such necessary things as I found I most wanted, particularly a chair and a table, for without these I was not able to enjoy the few comforts I had in the world. I could not write or eat or do several things with much pleasure without a table. So I went to work, and here I must needs observe that, as reason is the substance and original of the mathematics, so by stating and squaring everything by reason, and by making the most rational judgment of things, every man may be in time master of every mechanic art. I had never handled a tool in my life, and yet in time, by labor, application, and contrivance, I found at last that I wanted nothing that I could not have made, if I had had the right tools. However, I made an abundance of things, even without proper tools, and some with no more tools than an adze and a hatchet, which perhaps were never made that way before, and that with infinite labor. If I wanted a board, I had no other way but to cut down a tree, hew it flat on either side with my axe, till I had made it as thin as a plank, and then rub it smooth with my adze. It is true that by this method I could make but one board out of a whole tree, but I had no remedy for this, any more than I had for the prodigious deal of time and labor which it took me up to make a plank or board. My time or labor was worth little, however, and so it was as well employed one way as another. However, I first made a table and a chair, as I observed above, and this I did out of the short pieces of boards which I brought on my raft from the ship. When I had hewed out some boards, I made large shelves of the breadth of 1.5 feet, one over another, all along one side of my cave, where I laid all my tools, nails, and ironwork. I knocked pieces into the walls of the rock to hold my guns and all things that would hang up. As a result, my cave looked like a general magazine of all necessary things. I had everything so ready to my hand that it was a great pleasure to me to see all my goods in such order, and especially to find my stock of all necessaries so great. And now it was that I began to keep a journal of every day's employment. Before this I was in too much hurry, and not only hurry as to labor, but in too much distress of mind, and my journal would have been full of many dull things. I shall here give you the copy, though in it will be told many particulars over again, as long as it lasted. As I have said, when I had no more ink, I was forced to give up. I think we'll stop. Well, no, we'll keep going on. Let's keep going on. No, I will stop because I think the next part goes for quite a while. It's called the journal. So we will start that next time. Thank you for listening. Bye-bye.